Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Jan Roller, and I'm a member of the Board of Trustees of the club. I must extend a special warm welcome to the brave souls who've made their way down to 9th and Euclid on this blustery, snowy day. Your love for free speech in the city of Cleveland is duly noted. In honor of Black History Month, the City Club is honored to bring to its podium Daniel Biddle and Murray Dubin, the authors of Tasting Freedom, Octavius Catto, and the Battle for Equality in Civil War America. The book chronicles the life of Octavius Catto, an important and almost forgotten Black educator, intellectual, and civil rights activist of the 19th century. Tasting Freedom has been described as a masterfully researched and cogently written historical feast. It is a must-read for those interested in American history and the struggle of African Americans to achieve freedom and equality. Dan Biddle and Murray Dubin bring mid-19th century Philadelphia to life in their account of Octavius Catto. Both are native Philadelphians and longtime journalists for the Philadelphia Inquirer. But Cleveland is also a special place for Dan Biddle, who started his professional reporting career at the Plain Dealer in 1976. He reported on such important stories as the Carnival kickback scandal and the conflict between CEI and Muni Light. And Dan, I'm sorry that today probably reminds you of when you were here on January 26, 1978, the day of the great blizzard in Cleveland, when it was punished with up to 40 inches of snow and 80-mile-an-hour winds. We won't reach those numbers today, but the weather certainly has reduced our audience this afternoon. After leaving the Plain Dealer for the Inquirer, Dan earned a Pulitzer Prize and other national awards for his investigative stories on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. He is a Nieman Fellow at Harvard and has taught at the University of Pennsylvania. Murray Dubin wore many hats at the Inquirer when he worked there from 1971 to 2005. He went back and forth from reporter to editor. He was the paper's West Coast correspondent for 3 years and was even its fashion editor for a while. Tasting Freedom is his second book featuring Philadelphia. In 1996, he wrote South Philadelphia, Mummers, Memories, and the Melrose Diner, about the oldest ethnically and racially diverse urban neighborhood in the country. He also wrote a rules book for the game of Wallyball, one he admits that was before its time. The two paired up to write Tasting Freedom when they learned of their mutual interest in the life and times of Octavius Catto. Gentlemen, welcome to the City Club of Cleveland.
John, thank you for that very kind introduction. And we're both thrilled to be at the City Club of Cleveland, especially me. I could see why you invited Dan. He's a former Clevelander. He worked at the Plain Dealer. Dan's won a Pulitzer Prize. Dan's a big deal. It's a no-brainer, but it's very nice of you to let me tag along, so thank you. We've spent about 7 years writing this book about a man named Octavius Catto, who you've never heard of, and a civil rights movement in the 19th century that you also probably have never heard of. The first thing we wrote in 2003, and that we've rewritten about 20 times, is the preface to the book. It's about a page long, and I'd like to read it. It's called October 10th, 1871. The young white man had the number 27 tattooed on his hand and a bandage around his head when he began shooting at a colored man named John Fawcett. He missed. Fawcett, a hod carrier from the filthy neighborhood of Frankfurt, ran up South Street to escape. Joined by a crowd, the bandaged man chased him. Fawcett saw a cellar door in front of a store in the middle of the block. Before he could dive in, a white boy stuck out a foot and tripped him. Fawcett scrambled to his feet, and the bandaged man fired again. That same afternoon, about a mile away, another Negro, a school teacher with the Roman-sounding name of Octavius Valentine Catto, left a pawn shop on 3rd Street and began walking home. People on the street knew who he was. He was an orator who had shared stages with Frederick Douglass, a second baseman on the city's best black baseball team, a teacher at a black school of national renown, and an activist who had fought in the state capitol and on the streets for equal rights. He was 32. It was Election Day 1871 in the busy South Street area of Philadelphia. The institutional and emotional heart of the black community had been rocked by violence since the night before. Was it all the squire's doing? White policemen and Democrats who answered to him were attacking black voters, and scores had already gone to the hospital. Catto had sent his pupils home early. Rather than going directly to his boarding house, he chose a safer route, up Lombard Street to 9th, near his fiancée's home, and then down to South Street. He lived at 814. Catto walked with an assured, athletic gait, as if his right to the pavement were guaranteed, which it was, but only lately. Memories of slavery haunted every colored home. Generations of men and women had risked their lives to claim the simplest of rights: to learn in a schoolhouse, serve in the army, ride the railways, cast a ballot. Now those rights were being tested. Catto turned onto South Street at the moment when W.E.B. Du Bois's words, Americans of color were first tasting freedom. As Catto walked east, the bandaged man was looking for more Negroes to hurt, more Negroes who would not be able to vote that day. He passed Catto nonchalantly, but once he was 5 steps beyond, the bandaged man turned and crouched. A young girl at 822 South Street shouted to Catto, "Look out for that man." The bandaged man was pulling out his gun. Dan and I have been fortunate to do some other speaking events, and invariably the question we're always asked is, why did you write this book? Not articulated in that question is, why did you two white guys write this book about this obscure black guy who was part of an even more obscure civil rights movement? And it's actually a rather easy answer, and it's the same answer. Dan and I are newspaper guys. Even though Dan seems very young, we actually have about 70 years of experience between us. Newspaper guys, by and large, have different minds than everyone else. They're not better, they're not worse, they're just very different. My mind is wired to walk through my life, and everything I see, I say, is that a story? How do I do that story? Who should I talk to? It makes people around me crazy. In the 1990s, I was doing research on the South Philadelphia book in a library in Philadelphia, and a wonderful archivist there suggested I read one of 2 academic articles that existed on Octavius Catto. I did, and I was blown away by his life. I had never heard of him, and was rather ashamed that I never heard of him. I didn't understand why no one had taught me Catto in school. There's a very little bit of Octavius Catto, about 5 paragraphs in my South Philadelphia book. But I knew he was worth more. And for the next few years, anytime I had spare time, I tried to do research on Octavius Catto. Unbeknownst to me, my colleague at the Inquirer, Dan Biddle, was also fascinated with Catto. Dan was in a fiction writing workshop in hopes of writing a novel. Hasn't done that yet. And was looking for a subject to write about. He was in his car, and the news radio station in Philadelphia had an interview with an historian named Roger Lane, who's a teacher at Haverford College in Philadelphia. He had just written a book about Black Philadelphia history, and he talked about Catto on the radio, just a little bit. And Dan was also blown away and fascinated. And Dan wrote a really good short story about Octavius Catto. Go forward to 2001. Dan and I are in the newsroom together, and he says something to me like, "What's going on?" And I tell him of my fascination with this guy he's never heard of. And he said, "Who?" "Octavius Catto." And Dan says, "I'm fascinated with him too." And I'm shocked, because there's only 8 people in the world who's ever heard of Octavius Catto. And Dan and I look at each other, because we both know that the other guy wants to write a book. And it's sort of like high noon, but without guns, with computer mouses. And we stare at each other, and the question is whether we're going to retreat to our own computers or whether we're maybe going to join forces. And we put the mouses down, and we shook hands and decided to write a book together.
Where is this? a little bit. So much fun, this podium. First off, I can't begin to tell you what a thrill it is for me to be here reading to you from this book for this audience at this great organization in this great city. Back around that time Murray described, when we first shook hands and made this exotic deal, lucky for us, Google had come along by then. And we often joke that Google should probably be the third byline on this book. Every night for a while on my job at the Inquirer, when my work was done, I would go into Google, and when we were really in our earliest research on Catto's life, I'd run his name, and I learned quickly that in the 19th century, you know, we're not real historians, we're just journalists, so we had to learn all this starting out. The 19th century was an era of terrible spelling. So you had to spell Catto many ways to search old documents and records in Google, so I did that a few nights in a row. And one night in doing that, I found a note on one of these genealogy websites, such as Ancestry.com, you know, where you can try to reconstruct your family tree. A man from Alexandria, Virginia, by the name of Leonard Smith, had put a note up saying that he was looking for any information anyone out there might have about his great-great-grandfather, William T. Catto, and William T. Catto's son, Octavius. Well, I got excited and shot an email to Leonard Smith and asked if he'd share his phone number with me. And this black man in his early 60s, who at that time ran a wing of a hospital in Alexandria, a total stranger to me, shares his phone number. And by the next night, we're on the phone. And it was one of the most exciting phone conversations of my life. Leonard explains that he, too, was fascinated with the life of this ancestor of his, Octavius Catto, and Catto's father, from whom Leonard is directly descended. He told me how his grandmother, who had only passed away a few years earlier in her late 90s, had always told him that he had this civil rights hero as an ancestor, somebody most people had never heard of. Leonard said, for instance, when the name Rosa Parks came up, his grandmother would say to him, you know, Rosa Parks wasn't the first one to sit in. Your great-great-uncle, he sat in also. So we had this great conversation, and Leonard said he would dig out all the family lore that he could about Catto, and he said, I'm very enthusiastic about you guys wanting to do this project. I'll help you any way that I can. I, too, am fascinated with Catto's life. All I ask is that you have Denzel play him in the movie. And Leonard has been a great help to us ever since, and we could not have done this book without him. The first time we sat down and had lunch with him down in Alexandria, and this is already 7 years ago, he said one other thing, that we should remember that there were 100 O.V. Cattos, and not to put too much emphasis on his ancestor at the expense of the other 99. I thought he was just being humble because he was referring to his own ancestor. The truth of those words grew on Murray and me, however, in every week of research that we did after that. There were 100 O.V. Cattos. We even took to making that the title of the introduction of our book. There were men and women, young and old, all over the free North, and many even in the South, who years before the Civil War and right up through the war and after emancipation and into the years of Reconstruction, fought the battles that we think of as the battles of the modern civil rights movement. They fought to integrate the streetcars, to get into classrooms, to win the right to serve on a jury, to own property, to cast a ballot. And like that modern generations that we know better, they wound up with their heads bloodied and their bones broken and in many instances, their homes or schools or churches ransacked or burned, and yet they went back for more, like the modern Freedom Riders. And they lost many of those battles in that harder time, but they also won some. Along with the radical Republicans of those days, they won the right to vote. They won the right to ride in public transportation. They won other victories, and yet, for most modern Americans, with the exception of a few historians and a few descendants, people don't know their stories and don't know of their bravery. And with this book, Murray and I intend to change that. I'm going to take you to about 1848. That's a big year in our story. The Catto family, which came out of South Carolina and was an unusual family there in that they were free people of color, which put them in a very strange and dangerous predicament between enslaved people and slave owners. But they managed by hook and crook to get to Philadelphia by 1848. And William Catto, Octavius' father, in 1848, Octavius just 9 years old. But his father has managed to make his way out of that slavery world, and not only into the North, but into the lap of what was then a burgeoning civil rights movement. And he was, by the end of 1848, leading meetings with men like Frederick Douglass and men and women that most Americans have not heard of, like Henry Highland Garnett and Martin Delany and the Langston brothers from Ohio and John Rock from Boston. And they were leading not only anti-slavery meetings, but equal rights meetings. And you know, once again, Leonard Smith's words to us just rang truer than ever as we kind of learned about this generation in which Catto's father took part. They were, by 1848, crisscrossing the North, leading anti-slavery meetings, giving equal rights speeches in New York State and Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and Indiana and Ohio. And they did so at some peril. And I'm going to read to you from an event that happened in the late spring of 1848, give you an idea of the world that William Catto was moving up and into as he joined this movement of free men and women. And one of the people that he was that he got to work with was Martin Delany. Anybody know that name? All right, that's a pretty good. I mean, something Murray and I have found over and over again in doing this research was, if we hadn't set out to write this book about Catto, there were a lot of other great candidates for a book like this, and Delany was one of them. Very dark-skinned man, homeschooled, and homeschooled at his peril, because once the people of the town where he grew up, in the western part of Virginia, actually in what's now West Virginia, once it became known that Delany's mom was schooling her children, there was such a frowning upon and a criminalizing of black learning in those days that the Delanys got banished from their town for the crime of schooling. Well, that tossed Martin Delany all the way up to Pittsburgh, where he managed to open up a black newspaper, help lead an underground railroad station, lead an exploration into Africa, write a who's who of black American leaders in 1852, write a novel that ran to something like 61 chapters, go on to serve as an officer in the Union Army. And what else did Delany do? Explorer. But back in 1848, he was just one of these proselytizers trying to whip up support, both white and black, for abolition and equal rights. In late June of 1848, Martin Delany visited Marseilles, not France's port city, but its namesake, a village in the cornfields of northwest Ohio. Then, as now, local people pronounced it Marseilles.
Drinking my water.
I'm sorry. Okay. We've been sharing all these years. It's second nature. Delaney and his Ohio contacts, the light-skinned Negro abolitionist Charles H. Langston, were riding north from a meeting in Columbus, and they stopped at the hotel of a sympathizer in Marseilles. The sun was setting, and the townsmen were pitching quoits in the main street. When they saw the two Negroes climb from a carriage, the game came to a halt. In the hotel, local men buttonholed the visitors and proposed an impromptu anti-slavery meeting at the schoolhouse. Would Delaney and Langston agree to address that meeting? They could not say no. They washed up and started for the schoolhouse. As they walked, white men and boys, in Delaney's words, fell in close to our heels and followed them to the schoolhouse. Sensing a trap, they declined to speak. The man who had invited them shouted, "I move we adjourn and consider this a darky burlesque." A cry went up from the crowd, "Darky burlesque!" And the swelling, almost festive audience followed them back to the hotel. Delaney and Langston watched from a window as whites lit a barrel of tar and shouted, "Rush in and take them! Kill the niggers!" Delaney could hear what he called 1,000 demoniac howls, along with talk in the crowd of taking him and Langston south to sell them. A blacksmith began forging handcuffs. Boys blew horns and banged tambourines as the fire lit the night. Delaney secured a butcher knife and vowed not to be taken alive. The innkeeper and a one-armed Mexican War veteran tried to calm people down. The veteran said, "Didn't you hear the way that black fellow talked? These are educated Negroes." In time, the crowd's energy ebbed, and at dawn, the two black men sprinted out. They reached their carriage amid a barrage of stones and shouted promises of death if they ever returned to Marseilles. Thus did a group of citizens nearly cut short Delaney's career as a doctor, orator, journalist, novelist, African explorer, and soldier, and nearly deprived the world of the poetry of Langston's future grandson, who went by the name of Langston Hughes.
Would you like my water?
Sure. Thank you, sir.
In addition to leaders of the movement, like Langston and Delaney, by the 1850s, lots and lots of African Americans, many of them young, were becoming involved in sort of fighting for their rights. A young Negro schoolteacher sued a New York streetcar line for ejecting her, screaming from a whites-only car on the Lower East Side. Within weeks, her suit received donations and letters of support from Negroes as far away as California. In Boston, black advocates asked the Massachusetts legislature to desegregate the public schools, anticipating Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka by 99 years. In Ohio, Martin Delaney's friend Charles Langston went to jail for helping Oberlin College students and their teachers swarm a slave catcher and free a fugitive. By this time, there was notice of this movement sort of spreading into the populace. And a song had begun. It was called "I Hear the Cry of Millions." And as a new feat of courage around the country was sort of became known, a new stanza was added to the song. At his sentencing, Langston turned to the judge and prosecutor and dared them to join the rescues. Quote, "Your children, to all generations, would honor you for doing it, and every good and honest man would say you had done right." A stenographer noted prolonged applause in spite of the efforts of the court. New verses were appended to "I Hear the Cry of Millions," an anthem of ever-changing struggle. And the newest stanza was, "I hear the voice of Langston, I hear the voice of Langston from Cleveland City Jail. Oh, set the captives free." One of the successful fights of this movement that Dan mentioned to you was the streetcar fight. While the Civil War took 4 years to win, the streetcar fight in Philadelphia took 8. In 1859, there were 19 separate streetcar companies crisscrossing the city of Philadelphia. It was happening all across the Northeast. They were horse-drawn, and they were very, very busy. Streetcar companies were not owned by the city or the state. They were owned by private entities. And those private entities, because they were afraid that white riders would protest, generally did not allow black riders to ride in the cars. We're not talking about sitting in the cars. We're talking about riding in the cars. Some of them, kinder than others, would allow white riders to stand in the front of the car where the slop and the dead animals and the junk on the street would sort of rise up and hit you in the face. The first letter to the editor in Philadelphia to protest this was in 1859. In 1866, Octavius Catto and several other men decided to protest this in a more organized fashion. They did it in a two-pronged way. One of the ways was civil disobedience, which shocked Dan and I because we didn't realize that people did that in the mid-19th century. Octavius Catto helped bring together pregnant black women and put them on streetcars in such numbers that the conductor could not throw them off. He put Lincoln College students in such numbers that they could not be thrown off. Black clergymen in such numbers that they could not be thrown off. And if they were thrown off, the publicity was very, very favorable to the black community and the efforts to desegregate the streetcars. Catto also came up with a strategy to go to Harrisburg and lobby for a new law across the state to stop segregation. Well, that was outrageous because black men in the United States did not have the vote in 1866. Didn't come till 1870. So why in the world would any legislator anywhere listen to a black voter who couldn't vote? Somehow Catto convinced them to listen. And in 1867, the governor of Pennsylvania passed a law ending the segregation on horse-drawn streetcars, not just in Philadelphia, but in the entire state. The difficulty, however, was whether the streetcar companies would pay attention to the law. Saturday's Philadelphia Press reported that Republican Governor John W. Geary signed the bill on a Friday, March 22. All that remained was to test the law in the streets. This was no routine matter. Men as old as Robert Purvis and William Whipper remembered when state law had granted them the vote, but gave no shield against white men's blows at the polls. Someone respectable should test the law. Better a minister or a teacher than a washer or a maid. Better a woman than a man. Someone to stand straight in a rain of words or blows. On the first Monday of spring, 1867, young women in Philadelphia were testing the new styles. The straw bonnets, the chintzes, plaid silks from India, and the new hoop skirts, only 3 yards round and more flexible, suited to modern times, to sitting at a teacher's desk or to riding in a crowded car. Under a cloudless noontime sky, the Ohio School's young principal and her assistant walked to 11th and Lombard Streets in Philadelphia, where the 10th and 11th Street Railway ran. The assistant was named Alice Gordon, and she stood by as her principal flagged down the yellow car. Carrie LeCount caught the attention of the conductor. His name was Edwin F. Thompson, and he looked right back at LeCount. He sneered at her, as one newspaper put it, and kept the car moving. He uttered the same words as heard by the war hero, the poet, the colored soldiers, and the loved ones, the minister with his ailing boys. We don't allow niggers to ride. Just a month past her 21st birthday, Karen LeCount was prepared. She promptly filed a complaint. In court, she held up a copy of the Philadelphia Press. with the news that the governor had signed the law. I know nothing of a new law, the magistrate said, and I don't trust that paper. LeCount went to his state office and returned to the magistrate with a certified copy of the law. Edwin Thompson and his company paid a $100 fine.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a Friday Forum featuring Daniel Biddle and Murray Dubin, authors of Tasting Freedom, Octavius Catto, and the Battle for Equality in Civil War America. We will return to our speakers in a minute for the traditional City Club questions. We encourage you to formulate your questions now and remind you to keep them brief and to the point. Members and guests alike are welcome to attend City Club forums, and we hope everyone listening will join the City Club and become active in our ongoing civic dialogue. Please visit our website, www.cityclub.org, to see a full schedule of our upcoming programs. Today is the City Club's annual Karen Faith Witt and A.H. Weinstein Memorial Forum on the Persecution of Peoples, endowed with generous gifts from the late Dale Solly in memory of his friend Karen Faith Witt, and from Norman Weinstein in memory of his father, A.H. Weinstein. Thank you for your support. We are pleased to welcome guests at a table hosted by the George Gunn Foundation. Thank you for joining us today. And now, we would like to return to our speakers for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphone today is Heather Sikora, our Marketing and Membership Manager. First question, please.
Welcome to Cleveland. This is the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War. There's this big statue commemorating the Civil War on Public Square. If you get a chance to stop by and look at it, it's huge. You mentioned Martin Delany. He was the highest-ranking black officer in the Civil War. You mentioned Frederick Douglass. I'm just wondering, what kind of interaction was there in Philadelphia with Martin Delany and Frederick Douglass and some other people during this time period? And what other struggles took place in Philly in the street? Because there were some other riots when people started to try and vote and take advantage of their rights, their newly free rights on the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Thank you.
Go. Should have warned me.
Well, for starters, we learned that Douglass and Delany, had been close allies and co-editors when Douglass first began publishing his newspaper, the North Star. And then, as happened with many of Douglass's best allies, there was a falling out. Exactly why, I'm not sure, but by the time Delany published his wonderful Who's Who book in 1852, they had fallen far enough apart that Douglass never even mentioned the publication in the place where I'm sure Delany thought he could get the best possible publicity, the North Star. But by the middle years of the Civil War, when the war was going badly for the North, and the Lincoln administration made the decision to open up the Union Army to black enlistment, Douglass and Delany, among many others, including John Mercer Langston in Ohio, were right at the front lines of that recruitment drive, almost from the moment that message came up from Washington. And we won't make you listen to us read all of chapter 11, but one of our favorite moments in this story is one in Philadelphia in March of 1863, when again the war's going badly and the Union armies need black soldiers, and Douglass and Catto and Catto's principal at the school that he taught at, and many other organizers of that early movement, including Delany, saw this opportunity to get the ticket of citizenship stamped literally in battle. And the speeches and the rhetoric of the movement at that point are quite moving and are all about the thought that if men enlist and serve honorably in the war and help save the Union, they will return, in Catto's words, to a redeemed country in which the price paid on the battlefield is rewarded with full citizenship, which of course did not quite happen. But some of the enlistment rallies are a wonder. There's one at Mother Bethel AME Church, the founding church of the AME church in Philadelphia, where Douglass, who as you probably know, had little use for the AME church through most of his life, took that occasion in that church to raise the rafters with a recruitment speech. And before his appearance there for recruitment was done, 5 Philadelphia black men got up and volunteered for the Union Army on the spot. And Douglass even led this packed house of worshipers and young men and women in singing the John Brown version of the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
You also have to understand that Philadelphia in the 1850s and 60s, and quite frankly through much of the 19th century, is the center of black life in the nation. It has the largest free black community by far, no one's even close, in the United States. It has the first church, the AME church, it has the newspaper, has literary societies, it has choirs, it has this incredible school, the Institute for Colored Youth, which is a school that teaches the classics. All the black leaders in the North are in and out of Philadelphia all the time. So the fact that Douglass was there and Delaney was there and the Cattos and Ebenezer Bassett, the principal of the school, it's where everyone met. And it's not surprising that the leaders of this movement were there all the time. Unlike New York, which has unfortunately a big riot during the Civil War in 1863, Philadelphia doesn't have a riot like that. I mean, Philadelphia, it's both the best of times and the worst of times if you're an African American back then. But it doesn't suffer the riot that New York did in 1863.
Thank you both for coming. I just had a question. You both mentioned the 100 other stories like Catto's. Mm-hmm. Do you see a follow-up to Tasting Freedom with these stories?
We've kicked that around. Something that intrigues me that I sort of think might make a sequel to this. We came across quite a lot of accounts of people who managed to escape slavery, often via the Underground Railroad, but where those same people then ran south to retrieve or attempt to retrieve a loved one or more than one loved ones. And there might be a book in there somewhere, I'm thinking.
I'm sorry, did you just ask me to spend 7 more years with him?
No, sure.
Only if you have it, you know. Do you have questions?
Oberlin College comes up several times in your book, and I just wondered if you would talk some about the role that Oberlin played in that period of history, and perhaps why it did, and just elaborate on that if you would.
Yeah. What a rare place back then. I mean, at a time when I don't think the number of colleges in North America, well, Canada was a bit different, but I think in the whole United States, pre-Civil War, there were only 3 universities that officially accepted students of color. And Oberlin was far and away the best known one. And, you know, when a college does something like that, you wonder if it will have any impact. Well, it did. I mean, we were blown away by how all over the free North, it was well known that Oberlin's doors were open. And, I mean, one of the other kind of heroes we got to know in this story, a woman named Fanny Jackson, whose full name, she got married and her married name was Fanny Jackson Coppin. There's a college in Maryland named for her now. She ran the school that Catto learned at and taught at. She ran it from about 1869 till the end of the 19th century. But she had been born in slavery in Washington. And not the Washington, D.C. that I thought I knew something about. When Fanny was born, Washington was a city where, thanks to one rumor of one black man whose last name was Snow, making a pass at a white woman, a riot began. And, I mean, something Murray and I learned was that riots back then are not what we think of as riots now. They were more, in the words of this one great historian Murray mentioned, Roger Lane, much more like pogroms. This riot in Washington consisted of mobs of white men and boys systematically targeting every black school in the District of Columbia, sometimes tearing schools apart while students and teachers were still in them, sometimes doing them the favor of giving them an opportunity to get out, driving black families out of their houses and into the woods. That's the world that Fanny Jackson grew up in. But somehow or other, she manages to get just enough tutoring and teaching under her belt by the time she's a teenager that another hero of that movement, Daniel Alexander Payne, who was really the first builder of the AME church, Payne had come out of Charleston, not unlike the Cattos, and Charleston, when all these men and women grew up there, black learning was literally criminalized. The law of South Carolina said that if you were white and taught a person of color reading or writing, you could be fined, and if you were black and did that teaching, you could be whipped. Out of that world comes Daniel Payne, who, not unlike William Catto, is in the Free North by the late 1840s, and he has this dream of founding and opening black schools and colleges. And he hasn't launched his own yet at Wilberforce, but he knows all about Oberlin. And when he gets word of this young girl named Fanny Jackson, who is very bright and very hardworking and has this incredible passion to not only teach but to raise up the rights and the intellect of her entire race, Payne learns that Fanny doesn't have any money to get herself into Oberlin, and he comes up with enough money to get her in there. And by 1860 or 61, she's enrolled at Oberlin, and she is a knockout. She is such a success there as a student that the Oberlin Dons, as they used to say, are inviting white visitors from other colleges to come and watch this strange phenomenon of a young black girl who's so smart that she's teaching white students. And even Oberlin, with its incredibly, now we would say progressive philosophy, they also take Fanny aside and warn her that if any of these white students or their families are too upset by the sight of a black girl teaching and learning there, that'll be the end of that, and they'll have to have her stop giving instruction and stop learning there. But Fanny's a hit at every stage of her life and goes straight from Oberlin to help run the school in Philadelphia that was a great success in its own right. And over again, you see that thing where Oberlin, was this great stepping stone where the purpose of allowing children of color to come there to learn really played out in an exciting way. Not to mention, they did these exotic things that even sound exotic by modern standards. They didn't celebrate was it the 4th of July?
Yeah.
They didn't celebrate the 4th of July at Oberlin. Instead, they celebrated West Indies Emancipation Day, the day that the British Empire abolished slavery. And instead of marking the 4th of July on that day, get this, they had Oberlin undergraduates go out into the towns around there and work at odd jobs, raising money for what? For anti-slavery organizations and the Underground Railroad. Now that is a college.
Yeah, it was really a beacon to the black community back then. If you would think of kids today saying, I want to go up and go to Harvard, it was Harvard if you were a black person in the 19th century. And we're not talking about very many black students, but whatever black student went there, it was just a big deal in the black community nationally.
Catto had a close friend in Washington, D.C. by 1860, when Catto himself is, all of 20 or 21. His friend Billy Wormley in Washington writes him a letter saying, young Lucy so-and-so is going off to Oberlin for 2 years, and I'm going to go there in a year myself. And the thought of a black man of 20 or 21 in Washington, D.C., writing, as if the world were completely open to him, it's a hell of a letter. And then he doesn't go there because he enlists early on in the Union Navy. And the next letter, and there's very few Catto letters to or from Octavius, which kind of broke our hearts. But his friend Billy Wormley, the next letter he sends to Catto is in the fall of 1861 when he's in the Union Navy and he's part of the group of sailors and artillerymen who have just won a battle in the harbor outside Beaufort, South Carolina, and have seized a Confederate fort.
Yeah, the Navy, unlike the Army, is not segregated.
And we could go on and on about
Yes.
Oberlin. I mean,
Especially him.
Amazing scenes there.
Convinced most of us that the historical significance of Catto, but I was wondering, what's your best explanation of why he is so obscure?
Wow. Yeah, we do get that question a lot. He dies very young. He dies in his 30s. He dies as he's just getting onto the national scene. Much of what transpired positively for that black community in the mid-19th century falls by the wayside at the end of the century with Plessy versus Ferguson, which basically makes equal rights for blacks sort of down the toilet. And Dan and I think there may have been a concerted effort to, quite frankly, not write the history of the successes of these extraordinary black men and women in the 19th century because, quite frankly, they're not out there other than in very academic history books. If you think about the 19th century, and you think about slavery, and I understand that, and that's fine, but there really hasn't been much until the last 20 or 30 years on the free black community in the North. And not only is Catto not very well known, I mean, I assume you've never heard of Henry Highland Garnett or John Rock or any of these other people. None of them are well known.
And every one of them, life story, they're knockouts. They're why those stories aren't taught to school kids is it's a sad thing.
With the exception of Frederick Douglass, they've all pretty much been lost.
This is a bit off the mark, and I'm almost reluctant to ask it, but
Go for it.
you bring a wealth of experience, background, and training to your research and your study that went into producing this book. I'm somewhat reminded of the 1950s and 60s when the great commentators of that era, like Edward R. Murrow, Eric Sevareid, were people we looked up to, yet today those people simply don't exist because you have to have the right hair and the right complexion to be on TV. No comments about hair. Journalism today is a grossly diminishing profession. Where do you see successors to yourselves coming that will be bringing us the stories in the next generation?
Oh.
That's a big one.
Yeah, you know what? What I said earlier about sort of having their brains wired differently, I really think that's so for a great many newspaper people, and we have some newspaper people out here. And I don't see any reason why the next generation won't be as nuts as we are and will have their brains wired the same way. So I'm not terribly concerned that they won't tell these stories. I just don't know whether there'll be print and paper for them to write it on.
Yeah, ditto. I mean, I think a lot of really good, hard-nosed investigative journalism is going on right now. And, you know, we all tend to see more of what's on TV and what's online and what gets the biggest splash. But, you know, a lot of really good reporting has been done out of Egypt and some good stuff out of Libya. A lot of great reporting was done to reveal the innards of the Wall Street financial crisis and who really pulled the strings into that. I mean, I'm, as kind of an old editor and reporter, I'm awed at how good a lot of that work is. It doesn't always get kind of prime time notice because now there's so much information out there online, and it's, you know, there are days where it feels like everybody is an amateur journalist now. But I think the best work is actually better than ever, and actually a lot of electronic resources make it way easier than it ever was when I was a reporter to collect good information in a hurry. So I'm hopeful.
Can you talk some about how Catto's story really challenges modern thinking about the civil rights movement And related to that, how do we as journalists and historians capture that sort of 100-year gap that is largely missing from the stories that we generally hear about that time?
You answer the first part.
Well, I don't know if this answers your question. We looked hard, but frankly, we'd gone so far and we'd already pushed our deadlines back and back and back. There's still much to learn for us about how that earlier movement may have fueled and informed the modern civil rights movement. Eric Foner, who's a great historian of the Reconstruction period and really changed the way history is taught about Reconstruction, told us that influence in terms of whether those earlier fights fueled or informed the later fights was a very hard thing to trace. As he put it, it was subterranean. That there were, to get at real evidence of how sort of Catto's generation and his father's generation might have left records or lessons or tactics that got picked up again 50 and 60 and 100 years later. I guess the best we could do was find out that a lot of the actual families in our story had descendants who sort of picked up the torch much, much, much later. One of our favorite, you shouldn't get us started on this because we can't stop, but we discovered that Catto himself, in addition to the great Leonard Smith, whom we got to know really well, Catto had a descendant who's still alive today, and he's lost his sight. He's in his 80s. His name is Edgar Catto Montgomery, who lives in Spartanburg, South Carolina, had done all his growing up and most of his career in Detroit, where a lot of the family had lived for many years. But he married a woman from Spartanburg, and they moved down there in the 1990s. And Edgar, and I'll never forget him telling us this because it was so, he kept sounding over and over again like the speeches and the writings of his ancestor. He said when he got to Spartanburg, he discovered that the schools were not yet integrated in the 1990s and that the black kids were being made to learn in trailers or in the third floor of school buildings that had no air conditioning. And there were no black teachers, and black teachers who tried to apply to that school system systematically were shut out. Well, that school system hadn't dealt with a Catto before. And he tells this great story of how he said to other black parents in Spartanburg, we fought these battles up north 40 and 50 and 60 years ago. What are we waiting for? And he helped organize Spartanburg around taking apart and rebuilding that school system. And he says to me on the phone the first time I talked to him, and he was not familiar with all the speeches of his ancestor, but he almost quoted him. He said, I went at the school board and said, you're going to have to change this. And if you don't change it, I'm going to contact the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, and they will come down and change it. And he kept his word. He and others brought a civil rights action that got Spartanburg schools much more truly desegregated and equalized than they'd been before. We lucked out with a few examples like that where someone who had a direct line to that earlier movement kind of picked up the torch. And then there were, we almost collected the names. Alan Locke, one of the heroes of the Harlem Renaissance. Locke's father and grandfather, his father was a student of Octavius Catto, and his grandfather, for a time, ran the school where Catto got his lessons and learning. And I could go on and on. There's that kind of sort of passing the torch. There's a bit of that. But further evidence of how the one movement led to the other, there's more there that we sure don't know about.
Yeah, there's I think a grandson of a student of Catto's who was a man who ran against George Wallace for governor, right. A black man. We have a chapter, the epilogue, that's really all about legacy and us struggling about the legacy. As for your second question about the 100-year gap, I think you got to read the book.
Mr. Dubin, I found it interesting that you wrote a book about the mummers in Philadelphia. And I've always heard that the mummers were a very segregated group. Was the mummers an outgrowth of this movement in the 1840s and 50s?
No. South Philadelphia, where the mummers sort of are born, and which is literally in the southern corner of Philadelphia, was a always working class, ethnically mixed and mixed race part of the city that existed before Philadelphia existed. It existed back in the 1640s. The tradition of sort of celebrating at the harvest time goes back a couple thousand years all over our cultures. And that's sort of what happened in South Philly, except that they did a lot of drinking and shooting off of guns, and it just started in a white Irish community. It spread to other white ethnic communities, and it became all white in the 1900s. At some point it became whites with blackface, and that was banned. And it pretty much is still all white, though there's no law against blacks participating, and some clubs invite black participants.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to Daniel Biddle and Murray Dubin, authors of Tasting Freedom, Octavius Catto, and the Battle for Equality in Civil America. Thank you, Mr. Dubin. Thank you, Mr. Biddle. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.